Hello and welcome to this week's lecture. This week we're going to be looking at depictions of disability in children's and young adult literature. So I wanted to talk about what kind of disabilities are depicted in books and kind of what the definition of disabilities is. And basically when talking about children's literature, it can be both mental, and the terms that are often used when talking about mental disabilities, especially when it comes to things like autism and other types of diagnoses like that, is neurodiverse. This can also apply to anxiety and depression and stuff. So neurodiverse versus neurotypical. So it's the language that I'm seeing people talk about themselves in that they are neurodiverse, whether it can be even dyslexia, processing things, and neurotypical. And it can also include other types of mental disabilities or mental slowness. There's all different kinds of disabilities that come under mental. And then physical disabilities. You more often see physical disabilities depicted, and particularly the most popular one is a wheelchair. That's the one you see most often. And this physical disability can be something that's from birth, or at any point in life, and really any of us can be disabled at any point in life. My nephew, who is I guess he's 31 now, 2 years ago was in a motorcycle accident and has lost use of his left arm completely, just from the shoulder down. It doesn't work. They're still hoping that they will be able to do something with new procedures coming along, but right now he doesn't have any use of it at all. So at any point in life, you can become disabled. So it's not just disabilities that are you're born with, particularly. So this seems to make it a huge category, and a really diverse category. It can be things like depression, as in The Memory of Like by Francisco Stork that I included on a list. Asthma, because that's something that affects how the main character, this Brothers at Birth, or Kind of Like Brothers, I'm sorry, by Co Booth, that I put on the list. That physical, so there's different types of things. It can also be temporary and permanent. You could have a physical or mental disability. Depression isn't always for life, and it can be something that you're going through at a time. Many times true long-term depression returns. So there's so many ways so many different types of disabilities. Again, as we talked in other categories, it's not just like when we talked with Latin American or Latinx literature, it's not just the categories, and the nuances within it are numerous. The same with Native Americans, where there's so many different tribes. Here with disabilities, it's a blanket term, but there's so many different things that it can represent. Given that, I actually had much more trouble finding books written by individuals with disabilities than I did the other diverse groups that we studied this semester. They're not tracked by the CCBC, which I've shown you. Larissa and I have both shown you statistics, which they only track Asian Pacific, African American, American Indian, and Latinx. I don't even know if I'm saying that right, Latinx. So it's often an overlooked category, and often you might not know without reading a description because you can't see it. There's often non-visual disabilities where you wouldn't know somebody was disabled just by looking at them. I thought it was interesting that the person that began, given this difficulty that I had, I thought it's the person that began the hashtag Own Voices was Corinne Duavis, who was diagnosed with autism in 2015. She's one of the authors that I gave you 2 books, I think, of hers on the list this week. And Own Voices is a Twitter hashtag that's meant to showcase works that are created by authors and illustrators who share the identity of their characters, such as a book with a deaf protagonist being written by a deaf author. On the YALSA blog about this, Elena Leary wrote that Own Voices creators are so important because as marginalized people, they're the best at telling their own stories. It's great that more people, she goes on to say, it's great that more people are talking about how to write authentic, sensitive stories outside their experience and getting sensitivity readers involved. But it's also important that marginalized people are able to tell their own stories. And that's what Own Voices does. It allows them to be a voice in their own storytelling when stories are about marginalized communities have historically been told by privileged people. Matter of fact, she says she's talking to disabled writers who've been told by editors that their characters weren't relatable enough because of their disability. So it's a difficult category, and it's not well represented, I don't think. I think none of them are very well represented, but I think disabilities, except for there's a lot of teen novels about mental disabilities. I think otherwise, I really had a hard time with picture books. There was not a lot of quality picture books written from within the community that I could find there, which I'm really trying to give you in the literature that I choose for you to read. I'm really trying to give you some really pure Own Voices type material. I don't always succeed in that, but because I want to give you a few more choices, but picture books seem particularly difficult to find. So if you're looking, Own Voices is not just disability. It was started by somebody who was interested in diversity from a disability viewpoint, but it can be a good resource to keep up with what's going on. The hashtag is not moderated, and there's no hard and fast rules other than it should be somebody who, if they're writing, not just if they're writing, if they're deaf, they're writing about another disability, but if they're deaf, they're writing about their main character or somebody important in the book is deaf also. If they're have autism, they're writing a character with autism. It needs to be that. But it can also be if they're African American, they're writing an African American character. And some people are not as some people are very specific about not writing outside your own experience and not using stories of other cultures, but I think some within the disability community and some within the larger diversity community are not as strict about that, and say that authors shouldn't write outside their own experiences, but they need to make sure they do their research. And I was struck by the review of Wonderstruck that talked about how Brian Selznick, the author, really did his research. But also, they mentioned, I read somewhere where he mentioned in a speech what he calls horizontal identities. Selznick felt that the isolation he felt growing up gay helped him understand the isolation of the deaf culture, and that led him to do additional research. He did Wonderstruck takes place in 2 different time periods, and he did a lot of research about how it would have been to be deaf in one time period versus the other. So Selznick saw a similarity between his experience as a young gay man alienated from the queer community and history and the experiences of many deaf people who grow up in hearing families and must survive the isolation to seek out the deaf culture and history afterwards. So evidently there's and this is something new to me that I learned this week, working on this lecture. He referenced Andrew Solomon's theory of horizontal identities, which are identities linked to others outside the families and communities of our childhoods. So it's interesting. I included this book just because it seemed that he was drawing on his experience. It's not an own experience. It's not an own voices book. It wouldn't fit the criteria for own voices. But it's another way of looking at authenticity and what they're drawing on in order to write the book and write a representation and a depiction of the character with the disability and how they deal with it in a way that is knowledgeable. One of the things Own Voices does not include is if you have a child with a disability. That's not considered Own Voices, although you can be very attuned to and aware, and I think it's a great research, it's a great area, thing to draw on, writing from your experience as a mother or a sibling to somebody with a disability. It wouldn't be considered Own Voices because they are not experiencing that disability. So I don't know if I said this before, but Own Voices is not moderated, so people can post whatever they want on there. But it's become a community where people share questions and experiences and talk about the experience writing. So it's become a good place, and it can be a good place to follow on Twitter, to check out the hashtag every once in a while. You can't actually follow the hashtag, but check out the hashtag every once in a while just to see what's going on within that community. I wanted to talk about some other issues surrounding disability in media and literature. Inspiration porn is really talked about more in media, but it also applies to literature. It's talked about a lot with films and in actual life, but it's when you consider someone inspirational solely because they have a disability. And it's a problem because disabled people don't exist to inspire others, and simply living with a disability isn't something that should inspire other people, is what people from within the disability community say. Is it inspiring when somebody does something amazing? Absolutely. Is it amazing to continue existing when you have a disability? No. Additionally, they feel that just being inspired because somebody's going through everyday life with a disability objectifies the person rather than seeing them as an individual. They become their disability, not Sue, who has this disability. Unrealistic portrayals can be a problem. Unrealistic portrayals, and in addition to that, putting people in books, somebody in a wheelchair, it's like adding a best friend who's black, or so my best friend's in a wheelchair, and you ticked off the diversity box. So you have to watch portrayals that have people who have disabilities either doing too much or too little. What's a realistic portrayal of what they can do? Another thing that happens often with depictions of disability is that disabled people are often portrayed as villains. If you think about Disfigured or Disabled, Joker and the Batman, the scientist in Wonder Woman, if you've seen that movie, she's disfigured. Disabled people are scary, or seen as having their a lot of times it'll be there's a lot written about the fact that if you are schizophrenic, you're not necessarily violent, but it seems from movie portrayals that being psychotic or schizophrenic just automatically means that you're violent. The opposite is when they're just seen as saints. They're stereotyped as people are perfect just because they're disabled and they can't have anything wrong with them. They don't have any character flaws. They're just a saint in a wheelchair or something like that. So those are pitfalls and stereotypes that people fall into when they depict disabled people in books. The other issue that occurs is magical cures, a common trope where a character's disability is fixed through magic, and it perpetuates the idea that the only good resolution to a story in which a character has a disability is for that disability to disappear. It's gone. So that's the end goal, is to have it disappear. Now, it is, and often this is the solution to a problem. I mean, it becomes, they're magically cured and they go on to save the world, rather than saving the world with the issues that they have, which can happen. You know, disabled people are able to also be strong characters and do things that other characters would do. I just finished a book with a character with cerebral palsy, who is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, and she becomes the heroine not through her physical abilities, although she has some physical abilities that she uses, but more through her brain and just being who she is, and she's able to change the situation that she's in, because while not being cured of her disability. I'm interested to see this. The book doesn't come out. I picked it up at ALA. The book doesn't come out until August, I think. I'm interested to see if they review it on the one resource I'm going to share with you at the end of the slide, and if people feel like it's too unrealistic in what she can do physically. Although the author specifically says it's not an own voice book, but the author specifically says that she did her research and then has a friend that she's had for a long time with CP, and would call her up and say, could you do this? Could you physically do this? And the friend would say yes or no. And the other interesting thing with disabilities, again, as to how nuanced they are, is even within a particular disability, there's levels of what people can and can't do. So what might work for one character doesn't work for another, you know, wouldn't be possible. You know, one person with that disability can do it, another person can't because of whatever reason. They're physical. It's just like me. I can't be tall. I'm short. I was born short. I can't reach those top shelves, so I got to use a stool. You know, there's certain things I just can't do. Whereas somebody else who's also born a white female with blonde hair is taller and can reach those top shelves. And that's a silly example, but you know what I mean. So the other thing I wanted to mention, and this comes out again of the media world, and it's called the Tyrion test. After, if you're a Game of Thrones fan, Tyrion is the dwarf character in Game of Thrones. There's a lot of debate about what the correct terminology is. Little people seems to be the current term to use, but his character is so interesting in Game of Thrones, if you're familiar with Game of Thrones at all. And so the Tyrion test was developed based on the Bechdel test, which has to do with women in movies. But with the Tyrion test, at least one character with disabilities involved in significant plot developments not centered on their disabilities. And a lot of what Tyrion is dealing with has to do with other issues that are going on within his family. And of course, you know, his disability plays a part in it, but the plot development, it's not, you know, because he can run under the horse, he's so, you know, he's so short he can run under a horse, then he, you know, saves the world. It's, you know, his brain and how he thinks and what he does have nothing to do with his, you know, there are some plot developments, of course, because he was not considered, he's considered a black sheep of the family, in part because he's not, he is a little person, but there are other plot developments not centered around his disability. Disabilities are depicted realistically, neither more or less severe than they would be in real life. And disabled characters are givers as well as receivers. So often you see a disabled character that's just there for the main character to show how helpful they can be and how much they take care of somebody else and how good they are. And so they're constantly giving to the character. But the disabled character has to be a receiver, a giver as well. They have to be supported by other characters, not just supported by them. And this can happen in many different ways. So if you just look up Tyrion test, disability thinking blogspot, you will find a short article on the Tyrion test. But I think it's an interesting thing to think about when you're looking at both books and media using for children. And I'm teaching a class that looks at media and literature, which is why some of the stuff I'm giving you is both. I'm teaching a class in another department about that, and it's really been fascinating to learn about, and I've been able to bring a lot of it over to children's literature and connect what I've learned about diversity in children's books in general to this topic. So the one resource I relied heavily on this week, despite except for the other material, the material that I had in the other course I'm teaching, which has a lot to do with adult disability depictions. There's some crossover, of course, but this for children and YA literature, and basically they really don't have any picture books on here, which was the other reason I was having trouble finding picture books, is this Disability in Kid Lit, which was started by two individuals with disability. One is Corinne, who started the hashtag Own Voices, and hashtag Own Voices is synergistic with We Need Diverse Books. They've worked together. You know, those two hashtags often go together on a post, and you know they kind of are in conversation with each other. But this one has a lot of material. I've given you some things to read from it this week, including the review for Wonder that you're going to discuss in the discussion board. I want you to read this review, and keeping in mind the review and the other material I've given you to read, I want you to discuss pitfalls and positives and pitfalls for using this book within the schools, because it is often seen as a great book to use in schools. And this is a good resource. It's a very limited resource because it's only the books that are on here, but what I like about it is they're actually reviewed by the books. The person doing the reviewing is basically Own Voices. They're within the category that is that the book represents, which I think is a really valuable perspective. There's still differing opinions, just like some people love Harry Potter, some people hate Harry Potter. There's differing opinions on even these books from within the community as to whether they've succeeded or not. Always have divergent views of books, but I like reading the perspective of somebody within the community from which the book is depicting to kind of really understand what somebody would see, and it's particularly useful when you're thinking about what somebody might see, how they might be harmed by that book, what their objections are from the point of view of feeling like it belittles them, makes less of them, humiliates them, things that you need to think about when looking at choosing books. And that's it for this week. So I will see you on the discussion board. Thank you very much.